All right, guys, so now we're going to go through basically the priority system within the weapon system or within the actual fight itself. What we've done here is we've broken this down into a prioritized system. Now, we talked about BJJ, position before submission. Now what we need to do is we need to have a priority system. Now that we have achieved control over our opponent, now that we've achieved that clinch, we're in close, we're in tight, we're mitigating to a certain degree secondary attacks from individuals because of the closeness. What we need to do is we need to figure out where we're going to go from here. So there's a priority system. One thing that I want to understand is that from this position here, we never regress. Once we tie up to control, we never relinquish control. So this becomes a fallback point that we never retreat back from. This is important when we start getting into things like accessing your weapon. Again, talking about priority, talking about position before submission. If I'm going and I'm approaching an individual and I'm bringing a knife out on you and you circle around and try and take my back, I think we can agree that that would be a bad priority system. If I've got a knife out and you're seeing it and you completely neglect the knife in order to come in for a submission, that would be bad. So, weapons above submissions here. All right. Now, I've kind of broken this down just for rough numbers, just to give you an idea of percentage of success or maybe survivability rate. But basically, we have to understand that at best, we're at 80% in our best situation. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, the guy that you're fighting still has a say in the fight. There are circumstances that are going on that are out there that you are not going to have control over. What I want to be able to do is I want to be able to control as many of those circumstances as I can, but I have to understand that I'm never going to be able to control all the circumstances. All I can really do is get the greatest degree of control over my opponent that I can. So when we're talking about percentage of success or percentage of survivability, we're looking at 80% if I tie up to control and I'm able to access my weapon immediately. All right, when we're talking about removing mobility, we go down to 60%. And I'll get into these as I go. When we talk about disarms, we go down to 40%, and we go down to submissions, we go down to 20%. Now, again, those are percentages based on what I perceive your percentage of survivability is going to be. Now, would it make any sense for you to go from an 80% survivability down to a 20% because you completely neglected the weapon to go straight for a submission? Well, no, that would just be foolish. So what we want to do is we want to understand that there's things that we're going to do that are going to increase our survivability, and there's things that we're going to do that will decrease it. We want to stay on the increase side, on the positive side of that equation. So when we're talking about accessing weapons, why is it that we want to access weapons? Well, at the end of the day, what are weapons? When we're talking about weapons, we're talking about, in first priority, we're talking about a firearm. Second to that would be a knife, and third to that would be your hands. All right, hands, knees, kicks, things like that. All of these things are offensive tools that I'm going to use in that fight. So when we're talking about weapons, one thing that we need to understand is that if you've ever played a video game, back in the 80s, we had these video games and you'd come in and you'd do the whole Kung Fu theater thing. And, when the guy got the sword, it was like, oh, now all of a sudden the damage that he's doing to his opponent, you start to see the damage bar go down, on your opponent as he's getting weaker because you have a weapon. Well, the same thing happens in a fight. The reality is that weapons in and of themselves are force multipliers. And what I mean by that is I mean that they multiply the value and the force that you are applying to your opponent. So when we're talking about weapons, there's a couple of things that we need to understand. When I'm going into this particular encounter and I'm actually tying up with this individual and I'm locked up on him and I go to access my weapon, there's two reasons why I'm doing this. Number one, I want to dispatch this guy as quickly as I can. But number two, there is the potential for other factors. Again, you don't control all the environmental factors out there. There is the potential for other individuals to be able to come in. So getting on my weapon first accomplishes two things. Number one, it dispatches this guy as quickly and efficiently as I can. And number two, it sets me up for follow-on attacks. This is why that is going to be higher in the priority system. The next thing that we're going to look at is we're going to look at removing mobility. All right, so if I can't access my weapon and I'm tied up with this individual, I can't access without giving up control on this individual. I need to have something to fall back to. Now, why is it that control starts to become impaired here in this particular situation? Well, largely it's because you have two guys that are in a vertical state, they're tied up, and they're trying to jockey for positions on each other. We see this a lot when we have trained guys against trained guys. Guys who know how to block and anchor weapons at the same time while they're fighting against their opponent. Now, we need to have some sort of a priority system to where we can tip those scales in our favor. And one way that we do that is we remove the guy's mobility. Because if I can drop this guy down to the ground, I remove his mobility and I remove his ability to actually jockey for position on me. And that becomes something that's really important to me, because now that sets me up to be dominant over him. Now, again, we drop this guy down to the ground. What are my options down at that point? Well, depending on how we chose to drop him down, I may actually drop him down and go down with him and maintain control over that individual, depending on whether or not, maybe let's say he's got a projectile weapon. So I drop him down, I'm controlling that weapon, and then we can start going for, again, accessing your weapon and so on and so forth. But let's say he didn't have a projectile weapon. Let's say he had a knife. Well, maybe I don't want to go down with him in that particular case, and I want to allow him to fall. And once he falls, then now I can access my weapon. What we're doing here is we're using hard control and soft control to basically be able to manipulate the situation to give us the advantage. So one of the things we've talked about before in the past, we've talked about soft control, where it's applicable, and what advantages there are to soft control versus hard control, and vice versa. So depending on the context of the situation, maybe what I want to do is I want to drop this guy down to the ground and maintain hard control because he's got a projectile weapon, and dropping him on the ground is not going to help me, because in that projectile weapon, he can still employ that even with that distance there. That's not going to be beneficial for me. But let's say he's got an edge weapon and I drop him down on the ground. Well, I may not necessarily want to go down with him in that particular case. Maybe I want the separation. So dropping him on the ground gives you the separation that you need. Again, soft control is limited. It's only going to, you only have control to the degree that he's able to get back up and assault back in on you. But it might buy you the time that you need to be able to access your weapon. So as I drop this guy to the ground, I maintain a vertical state, I clear access my weapon, and I go ahead and put him down. So this is where removing mobility comes in, and removing it to hard control or removing it to soft control. All right. So next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at disarm. Keep in mind that we're talking about all this kind of in the vertical state and stuff. When we're talking about disarms, all right, we see this all the time, and you guys will see disarms being done. We have to understand that disarms, at best, you're talking about a 40% success rate. Disarms are difficult, okay? When you have two guys fighting for real estate on a weapon, particularly when you're talking about a gun, and depending on the type of gun it is and things like that, this is where weapon selection becomes like super critical. You have a weapon that has a longer muzzle and a shorter grip. What you're doing is you're giving your opponent more real estate and more leverage to be able to disarm you. You have a weapon that maybe has a short muzzle and a short grip. You're not going to be able to get a full grip on that weapon, and you're going to have grips fail and stuff like that. So we have to understand that smaller is not necessarily better. I want to go only as small in the weapon as I can to not be disarmed, but I still want to maintain a high enough capacity with my round count and stuff like that to be effective, because as we start getting into utilizing weapons, one of the things you're going to see is that it's going to take you a lot more than the 4 rounds or whatever that you have in your, LCP or whatever. You're going to be using rounds a lot, and your hit rate is going to go way, way down. One of the comments that I receive almost at every single class when I get comments and feedback at the end of the class is, I never realized how difficult it was to actually shoot someone who didn't want to be shot. And that is 100% true. When you get into a combative situation and you are tied up with an individual, it is incredibly difficult to shoot that individual when he is fighting you and you are fighting him, and he's pushing the muzzle away and you're pulling it back to retention, and all of these things are going on. The gun is going off, rounds are going everywhere, things like that. It is incredibly difficult to do that. So having 15 rounds in your pistol is damn sure a plus versus having 6 rounds from, an extended mag in your LCP. So just kind of keep that in mind. So when we're talking about disarms are important, all right, but they are much lower down on that priority scale and stuff. So we get into disarms, we're talking about manipulating the muzzle of that weapon, we're talking about manipulating that grip, manipulating the wrist so that we can affect grip and things like that. But those things are going to be more dangerous, and I think we can agree that if we just kind of think about this, if I'm in a situation where I can lock this guy in and I can lock his weapon in and keep him close and clenched and like he can't move, at that point, I think we can agree that it would be smarter for me to access my weapon, still maintaining control, and dispatch this guy quickly than it would for me to sit there and get focused on the weapon to the point of disarming him and then trying to shoot him. All right. Now, why is disarm in there then? Well, because you may not have a weapon. Maybe the only weapon that is actually in the fight is the weapon that he brought. So I do need to have a contingency for disarms in there. So the last thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at submissions, all right? And I've already kind of briefly talked about this, but submissions are a useful tool. But we have to understand that if used out of context, they offer you no benefit whatsoever. Going back to the example that I used in the previous videos, if I were to come in and throw a choke on an individual who had a knife who's already out, or even had a gun that was already out, and I completely neglected that weapon to go for a submission, I think we can agree that that would be absolutely foolish. But if I were to prioritize that weapon, get control of that, and then work down into a position where I could either anchor and secure that while going for some sort of submission, or maybe putting him, moving myself into a position where I can affect the direction of that weapon, like for instance, going for an armbar, going for a Kimura, something like that, where I can affect where that muzzle is going or where that knife is pointing and still be able to break that limb, then submissions would be a vital thing. It would be something that could be used. So we have to understand that we have all these different tools: accessing, removing mobility, disarming, and submissions, and they all are part of the equation. But gone for out of order, they can put us in a less than ideal situation for our percentage of success and percentage of survivability. So we're going to get into more of this as we go. I wanted to be able to spend some time over these videos and go into basically the fight model, how it plays out, why it's important, and stuff like that. So you guys, train hard.